some of you may recognize this. If you do, you don't have to take your shoes off when you go through the metal detectors.
Gosh, I can't keep this up much longer. I haven't been on skates since I was a kid.
Well, it was your idea.
Yeah.
How much longer do we have to stay out here?
All the reporters will probably leave by dark. I guess it would look kind of funny if we denied the marriage now, wouldn't it?
I don't know what to do.
I don't either.
The word is either.
All right. The word is either. No use squabbling. That'll get neither of us any place.
The word is neither.
Things have come to a pretty pass. Our romance is growing flat. 'Cause you like this and the other, while I go for this and that. Goodness knows what the end will be. Oh, I don't know where I'm at. It's plain to see we two will never make one. Something must be done. You say either, and I say either. You say neither, I say neither. Either, either, neither, neither. Let's call the whole thing off. You like potato, and I like potato. You like tomato, and I like tomato. Potato, potato, tomato, tomato. Oh, let's call the whole thing off. But oh, if we call the whole thing off, then we must part. And oh, if we ever part, then that might break my heart. So if you like pajamas and I like pajamas, I'll wear pajamas and give up pajamas. For we know we need each other, so we better call the calling off. Oh, let's call the whole thing off.
You get the picture. You get, as we say in New York, the picture. So what's interesting, of course, about this particular, let's see if we can get back to our show here. Good. What's interesting about this particular scene from the 1937 film Shall We Dance is, of course, not necessarily the differences that we call dialect differences. They're really emphasized here. This is the full transcript of the different kinds of sounds. So either, either, neither, neither. Potato, potato, which doesn't really exist in English. Tomato, tomato. You know, this is a George and Ira Gershwin song, so, you know, there's some latitude. Respect is due. And then pajamas, pajamas. And then Rogers's verse goes laughter, laughter, after, Havana, Havana, banana, banana, oysters, oysters, as it were. Okay, so that's one kind of difference. And of course, for Havana, note in our own day, the fun that conservatives always have to poke fun at Professor Obama for saying Pakistan and Afghanistan. As it turns out, his roommate in Hyde Park was my former student, now Professor Aga of Penn from, you guessed it, Pakistan. So it's a little homage to his own past, as it were. So there are really two kinds of differences that we want to talk about that are systematically included in what we call a language. On the one hand, it's dialects, the norms that are correlated with where speakers live. So we talk about regional, town or city, or other, and generally geographic kinds of dialects. In pronunciation, the folk term, the term that we all use when we're not writing linguistics papers, is accent. And then, on the other hand, we now talk about sociolects, which, of course, are precisely what most of the differences, in fact, all of the differences in the Stair and Rogers number are about. That is to say, there's norms of use that are correlated with social circumstances, in particular, things like the position in society of the people who are using the forms. So social class, for example, socioeconomic class, ethnic group, age, gender, and so forth. Again here, but sometimes also simply called accent. So note this wonderful old New Yorker cartoon. that you all pass. It used to be when I first started teaching language and culture. It was a exam question. What's funny about this? So congratulations on your A. This, of course, cartoon picks up on the distinction between the lower-priced and the higher-priced sociolectal pronunciations, as it were, in transferring the differences, of course, onto the tomatoes or tomatoes themselves as the commodities of inherently different cost, and therefore presumably quality. Right? Consider by contrast then, now having looked a little bit at sociolects, consider dialects. Dialects are interesting facts about that really map the historical spread of English in North America from the Atlantic coast. You see the arrows, which give some sense of the particular flows from place to place. That shows these migrations that have moved, of course, from the East Coast, where English in particular, among all the colonial languages, remember there was Dutch, there was Swedish, there was Spanish, there was French. First off, where English, moving from the East Coast, moved west, dialectologists have painstakingly mapped the features of pronunciation, of vocabulary, and various other kinds of features of linguistic form in populations from place to place, trying to draw the boundaries then of where the particular differences lie. You'll also see the marvelously reticulated East Coast. Lots of small little dialect areas of which there are boundaries. This is the longest settled and most, in a certain sense, stable of the areas. And as one moves west, one gets into larger and larger dialect areas, so that there's really a kind of dialect area we now call Western English in a curious way, with some sub-varieties to be sure, but that spans a very, very large amount of North America. So here is where I want to get this other clip, which you can hear. I hope. No, that's not what we want. Where are you? No. It's really amazing how this technology can screw things up. I'm always flabbergasted at the possibilities for using up one's allotted program time.
I was born in West Point, Georgia, and raised in Lynette, Alabama, in a small southern community of towns, which was referred to as the Valley. And this area is located on the Alabama-Georgia line. It's about 90 or so miles south of Atlanta, Georgia. I've always lived in this area except for the time that I attended college in Monoglod, Alabama. And as far as I know, all of my family lived in this area before me, for as far back as anybody can remember. And for many years, the cotton mill industry was actually the lifeblood of the Valley area. The mill company provided jobs for most of the people there, money for schools, and also a lot of recreational centers.
A little bit about myself. I'm one of 5. I'm a twin. We were the last to be born in this very large family, and we had 3 bedrooms to share for 7 people. Not easy, but it happened. And we lived. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, 2nd floor walk up, and it wasn't too bad. We all made it. We all helped out. We all cooked. We all made our beds. We waited in line to go to the washroom. We banged at the door a little bit. we got a bath once a week. Well, maybe twice a week. But it wasn't too bad growing up.
Thought it was a fair price for a cure. We grew up in 66 West Gun Hill Road, right across the street from a beautiful golf course. So we had a golf course on one side and a park on the other. My brother and I were very close growing up. We used to do a lot of things together. We used to play in the house. We would make up stories and poems and all kinds of fun stuff. And my mother worked. And on Sunday, my dad used to take us every Sunday. We would pick a place to go, and we would go and have the day, my brother, my dad, and I. And one Sunday, we'd go ice skating. We'd go up to Bear Mountains, and we would ice skate up in Bear Mountains, and that would.
You can plot even individual features. By the way, I presume you understand the first one was self-announced as from Alabama. The second speaker was a Chicagoan, and the third was from the Bronx. All about the same age, by the way. They were all born at about the same time, so had relatively similar experiences, at least in the macro social environment. But you can plot individual features even by this method of dialectology. Here's the features of the pronouncing or not pronouncing the R sound as it's written at the end of syllables. So you can see there's a whole area in eastern New England, spreading out from Boston actually. There's an area immediately around New York City, around Richmond, Virginia, around Charleston, and then there's a kind of hinterland, the crosshatched area that spreads out from Birmingham and New Orleans in the South, again, where there's a kind of R-lessness that comes and goes. It's not as pronounced as in these other places. But so dialect differences, whether we talk about trying to map whole dialects or whether we talk about trying to map a particular feature and find out where it is that second way in which within a language we can talk about, as it were, America's tongues. Now, what is so interesting as well is the fact that we have something called standardization. Not every language is standardized. There are probably about 6,000 languages that remain in the world spoken. Probably a couple of hundred of them are standardized in this sense. Standardization, as you can see, at the national levels, certainly, superimposes do's and don'ts on people that enables people to orient to these do's and don'ts, providing instruction in them, for example, and having paraphernalia like grammar books and dictionaries and various now sound equipment that can be used for these sorts of things. It demands performance of standard in certain kinds of contexts that are contexts that people feel count, institutional contexts. For example, my own institution, the University of Chicago, is a fierce demander of standard. We correct students' papers to standard, for example. We correct even their pronunciations frequently. And with all of this kind of paraphernalia of standardization, it creates a certain kind of anxiety on people's parts about actually hitting standard register when they talk, especially when they think that someone powerful is listening to them. This kind of anxiety, I shouldn't say them, I should say us, this kind of anxiety that we live under in standard register is also not evenly distributed through the population. But once standardization takes place, the model that people have of standardization is this, that there's a standard register, which is like in a conical structure, the neutral top and center, and anything that deviates from it, what I like to call being down and out in your pronunciation, if you referenced, of course, to down and out in London and Paris, being down and out from standard is in a sense always negatively valued. That is to say, even though it may indicate something positive about you, that indicating of something about who you are and where you are in society is itself considered somewhat of a negative because you're not hitting standard, as it were. So with this particular kind of model, this kind of model where the standard exists as a kind of register ideal, a way of speaking that we imagine we could do if we do everything that's prescribed and avoid everything that's proscribed, this particular kind of model gets superimposed upon both dialectal and sociolectal variation. Now, what's interesting is we go back and look at this picture of the lack of R after a vowel or at the end of a syllable in these various areas. This particular map now, viewed from the point of view of standardization, reveals this. If you were to measure people, that is to say, take samples of their speech, and then measure whether or not they pronounce or don't pronounce the R at the end of words or at the end of syllables, like here's R pronounced wire, sword, glared, and here's R not pronounced, wire, sword, glad. Right? Notice there's no R. If you look at that and you compute these sorts of things up, here's what turns out to be the case. These are actual figures that are plotted from Bill Above studies from the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1963-64. But what is so interesting, as you can see, is that when you look at people pronouncing their language under these different conditions, on the one hand, casual speech, meaning when they're talking intimately to their friends, which he caught, by the way. I was chair of our IRB, which supervises ethics, he caught by simply not turning off his tape recorder. We're not allowed to do that anymore. Casual speech, then more careful speech, the speech of people responding to his questions in an interview, then finally giving people a page of print to read, so reading style. Then giving people a list of words where the words forms are absolutely central. And finally, what are called minimal pairs, a wonderful kind of test where you give people something like S-O-A-R-E-D and S-A-W-E-D and say, pronounce these two. So it's visually there and sort of hitting you in the face. Notice what happens. What he called the lower middle class, the group that's labeled 6 to 8 there, once they have a text in front of them, shoot way past the upper middle class, group 9, in terms of their use of post-vocalic R. That is to say, the crucial thing here is that there's an incredible anxiety about whether or not people are going to be hitting standard or not. Once they're in a situation where standard seems to be what is required, as for example, if you all remember learning how to read when the teacher was listening to everything you said and translating what was on the printed page into what you articulated. So one of the interesting things then is why then, given the fact that in every other country, it is the particular place where the most influential cultural, political, economic, and other forces and institutions reside that dictate what the standard is. London in Great Britain, Paris in France, Italy is a case where it was the north, Tuscany and Lombardia that were the most powerful, and sure enough, that's what standard Italian sounds like. In every other country, this sort of thing works. In America, it doesn't. That is to say, there's a paradox here. Why is it that American Standard Register demands post-vocalic R, whereas all of the cultural centers of the East Coast are R-less? Right? Paradox, yes? But an interesting kind of paradox, which it seems to me that we in a visual sense, now hooking into this marvelous exhibit that is downstairs, curated by Catherine Bossard. Here it seems to me is the visual evidence that we want to explore a bit. All pictures from New York. New York. Now, you can see that these are pictures of what we might want to call tremendous ethnic diversity, class differences of one sort or another, and the way in which the majority of Americans reacted to these kinds of situations, which they imagined and probably saw in their newspapers and heard about in radio reports and so forth for many, many decades, was this. That's to say, the well-dressed, well-heeled people, as you see his hand like up against his mouth as though, oh my God, this is the image that people had of these kinds of cities. It was in fact an image that was articulated quite widely among the people who were the standardizers, the people writing grammars and dictionaries and pronouncing manuals, and more importantly, from about the 1920s on, the people who were setting what we call broadcast standard. The people who were, in fact, writing the manuals for NBC network, for CBS network, and so on and so forth, right? Although urbanization, as you can see, by 1920, already had tipped to a urban majority country, 51.2%, as you can see in that census, and now we're over 4/5 urbanized. In the United States, notwithstanding the image of cities, especially Chicago, New York, and so on and so forth, during that particular period of standardization of pronunciation through the creation of national broadcast media, viewed cities this way. It's pretty strong stuff, but it's not atypical in terms of saying why, in fact, then the cities were not the place to look for a true American standard. But up here in that swath of North Midland rural bliss is where the real America can be found, right? The 49.8%. And indeed, they're not on welfare, don't worry. And indeed, in standardizing institution after standardizing institution, that's where the model for American standard came from, whether at the Ivy League institutions of the 1920s on, or the elocution departments of the radio and television networks. Broadcast standard, as it were, shunned urban America in its audible self-representation. So now, after 100 years, as it turns out, of such standardization, cities themselves have become transformed. We have been through suburbanization, of course, now into a gentrifying re-urbanization of the upper middle class. The core areas of the great American cities, in fact, have now become residential space, more and more, repurposing old commercial spaces, in part, and transforming the built environment into a kind of privileged core and a disprivileged periphery. New York City is no exception here. So that if we superimpose the cone of standardization, this is my little schema, if you superimpose the cone of standardization in central Manhattan, which is what that attempts to do, that's where the standard register hits, you will see that in a certain sense, the cone of standardization spreads out to the peripheries. And you have to therefore travel to find real New York speech. It's relegated to the peripheries, including the middle-class bedroom suburbias of northern New Jersey and Long Island. It's no accident that New York City speech is called Brooklynese, for example. One has to travel to exotic precincts at the end of bus and train lines to hear it. The cosmopolitan mobile residents of core Manhattan all speak standard. They're the only people, of course, who can afford to live there. Even Franklin Roosevelt, as it were, whom we should listen to.
Tonight, sitting at my desk in the White House, I make my first radio report.
Listen to his New York speech.
In my second term of office. I'm reminded of that evening in March 4 years ago when I made my first radio report to you. We were then in the midst of the great banking crisis. Soon after, with the authority of the Congress, we asked the nation to turn over all of its privately held gold, dollar for dollar, to the government of the United States. Today's recovery proves how right that policy was. But when almost 2 years later, it came before the Supreme Court, its constitutionality was upheld only by a 5-4 vote.
4.
The change of one vote would have thrown all the affairs of this great nation back into hopeless chaos.
Hopeless chaos. Yes, wonderful. So even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a New Yorker of upper-class distinction who spoke the old, cultivated sociolect of New York City dialect, would no longer be welcome, of course, at his townhouse on the Upper East Side. So we have then another paradox about New Yorkers or Chicagoans or Clevelanders or Pittsburghois, what I like to term a tendency to linguistic NIMBYism, right? As they're caught between a re-celebration of locality, right? That's the dialectal dimension of language, which they celebrate by moving into urban cores. As with upward mobility, a powerful American dream, they aspire to be speaking national standard. I hope you know what NIMBYs are. It's not in my backyard, right? So, of course, I want to have a waste disposal plant that's going to take away all of my recyclables, but not in my backyard. Put it somewhere else, right? So this is exactly the linguistic version of it. That's to say, I love my local ways of speaking so long as someone else is speaking them, right? I want to talk with the voice from nowhere. That's to say, I want to talk broadcast standard. My city's regional accent is charming, but let's be realistic about getting ahead. Right? Part of my essential being is hearing myself talk with my city's regional accent. It still comes out whenever I'm not paying attention, or whenever I'm drunk, or whenever I'm angry, or when so you hear a lot of these kinds of comments as well. Or I wish I could talk in my natural accent, but people would just devalue me in attractiveness or intelligence or accomplishment and so on and so forth. So people are really genuinely caught between these two propensities. They're on the one hand a kind of understanding of class and mobility and so on and so forth that's linked to standardization and its widespread use. On the other hand, a kind of affective longing, if only I could still be me. Do you remember Judy Holliday in Bells Are Ringing, I think it was? I want to go back to where I can be me, to the bonjour tristesse, bonjour brassiere factory. I want to go back where I can be me, okay. To the bonjour tristesse brassiere factory. So New York City itself has been hit by a terrible case of NIMBYism, as it turns out. In 1984, for example, William Geist of the New York Times reports on accent eradication programs. Recall that cone of standard-centered Manhattan, bringing those who are, as he calls them, afflicted from Staten Island, the Bronx, and Brooklyn to Midtown Manhattan speech clinics to help them become upscale. That's the crucial thing. They want to become upscale. But in 1993, we have Deborah Sontag says, now we all sound like TV announcers. Gewalt, peccato, scheiß, where has our dialect gone? It's disappearing. And still the lower middle class of the geographical periphery in their anxiety flock to accent eradication therapy. And in 2010, I noted Sam Roberts' article on New York City accent eradication, which was posted digitally on 19 November. The date is significant. And it unleashed a bombardment of 650 comments before the editors most very nervously turned off the flow, as it were, the next day, because they wouldn't want to take any more comments. So it's the same story, of course, that we've cherished since 1977, when we realized that John Travolta's Brooklynite character had to travel into disco-laden Manhattan for his own ascension to glitter and glam, right? In just the same way, here is Mr. Mullen, a New Jersey lawyer, the New Jersey lawyer, now an 11-year client, right, at this time. 11 years. It sounds almost like Woody Allen's psychoanalysis, doesn't it? An 11-year client of the late Sam Schwa, who died a few months after this picture was taken, the so-called dean of accent eradicators. Or here's another client, Lauren, well, of course in Italian would be Lo Giudice, but it's Lo Judice, as it were, who has also been going to accent eradication from the infamous Howard Beach neighborhood of Queens, who's a perfect example of the reluctant but compliant NIMBY. We can all feel her pain, of course, as we cheer on the, as she's called, Anglican-looking, and now, of course, Anglican-sounding, right? Where Anglican, of course, means wasp. It's a very interesting word. A career that she's made in film after going to Wesleyan University, as you see, and discovering that she actually spoke New Yorkese. Okay, over half of those hundreds of candid readers' responses were upset at people trying to lose their dialect features. They were indeed of the, you go girl variety. And many, like, as you see, respondent number 134, don't give up your accent, New Yorkers. I like the way you talk, New York. Learn to wear your accent with love and pride. Embrace the accent, New Yorkers. Why would anyone want to get rid of their New York accent? Don't do it. Treasure who you are, New York. That's my real favorite. But number 134 among these 650-ish comments is, for heaven's sake, a real New York accent is charming. A reminder that we have region differences. It's also becoming a rarity. That is to say, as I showed you from the cone of standardization, how peripheralized it has become in this urban area. Just as the same thing could be said, by the way, in Chicago or Cleveland or any such city. As everyone's accent merges into some kind of standard speech. When is the last time that you heard a really terrific Southern drawl from anyone under 50? What is not, indeed, you go to downtown Atlanta and you find everyone speaking standard, as it were. What is not, except perhaps the people who are service personnel, what is not appealing is the affected, gravelly, throaty, up-talking speech. You notice the notion of class ascendancy. Up-talking speech of a huge segment of the under 35 college-educated set. It's all of you out there, if only that were a detriment to being hired, this is a kind of phoniness index, as it were, of assuming standard where you really shouldn't, right? So many respondents, like number 134, recognize the distinction between cherished lateral geographical diversity, the regional diversity of our country, really like appellation, the designations in European wines and other foods that are specifically linked to locale and, in fact, government regulated, And on the other hand, the vertical dimension of register anxiety that comes especially through our system of education, all of that condensed here in this comment by number 134. But perhaps we should let John from Big Texas have the last word here. Right? I find it amusing how all you people here find this sad. Guess what, you folks, you arrogant New England liberals, right? This is readers of the New York Times, have been making fun of Texan accent for centuries now, and so on and so forth. As you see, well, guess what? Y'all will be getting a taste of your own medicine, right? Which I think is marvelous. We Chicagoans here in New England, of course, can only feel his pain. Thanks very much.
At this time, we'll open it up to you, the audience, with any questions. We have 2 microphones on either side of the room. We'll come to you. Yes, sir, right here.
So, Michael, in your professional ascent, can you recall any time when you changed your pronunciation or were pressured to? And have you and have you ever done that for your students? Or suggested that they do it for their...
Yeah, interestingly, I consider my sibling set an example of the effects of these of the kind of fierceness with which standard was imposed in places like New York City. My brother, who's 7 or 8 years older, for example, was put into speech therapy when he was in junior high school because he did not pronounce post-vocalic R's at the ends of syllables. So it was considered such a bad fault that it had to be corrected in that way. But within my family, it seems to me that there's a whole range of usage, and I'm at the high end, which indeed was constantly being reinforced through the elite schools through which I moved, both in New York City and beyond. So very definitely, whatever was at the most non-standard local range of my own speech as a child, which I have glimmerings of, has been more or less eradicated. It takes me as much effort now to pronounce New Yorkais as to pronounce any other accent, right? Which is all terribly interesting to me.
So every ethnic immigrant group has their own accent. Do you think it's detrimental for their upward mobility or something like this, or is it special rules for them because they're not American and they cannot get rid of the accent? It's kind of just not taken into consideration.
No, that's a very good question, actually. I was talking specifically about American English, of course, only. And if one were to talk about the larger landscape of language in North America, you would certainly want to talk about multiple languages. The fascinating change to me in the relationship of immigrant groups who are not English-speaking originally in recent years is this: that while in earlier generations there was a fierce imperative to learn English, to conform, and so forth, frequently because the kinds of immigrant people in the ethnic communities, certainly in the cities, were not of the privileged classes where they came from. That is to say, they were not already speakers of the standard version of their original language, right? This is certainly true of many Spanish speakers in the United States right now. They're doubly disprivileged. So not speaking the standard of their own, they frequently gave it up because they already had anxiety in their own linguistic community, right? And their children certainly start speaking English, right? So you have this interesting kind of what I call the inversion of ethnicity and class. And to become class ascendant, you have to lose your ethnicity, right? You don't manifest it in public. What is so interesting now under the forces of globalization is that virtually all of the ethnic communities have been reinfused with what we would call in sociology's cosmopolitan elites. People who are from the upper realms of socioeconomic privilege in their own home societies, who are moving around the world now, especially to various world cities. Think here, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, et cetera, and reinfusing those ethnic communities with a kind of notion that you can be an ethnic but also privileged, right? We're not merely talking about rich, we mean cultured, we mean knowledgeable about your own cultural traditions, et cetera, and able to appreciate them and continue them and maintain them. How many people in a Chinese urban ethnic environment 50 years ago spoke Mandarin? Very few. Now, Mandarin is the Chinese language which is being taught in the schools as, quote, Chinese, to ethnicize, in a multicultural sense, young American children of Chinese ancestral descent, right? Where originally the communities were all Southern Chinese communities, Cantonese speaking, a completely different language in the larger family of Chinese languages, of which there are about 7. Right? So what you really have, in other words, to go back to your question, is a kind of fabulous transformation which has taken place, which I'm sure is going to have impact upon let us say, the tolerance of Americans for multilingualism and multiculturalism. As you know, this has been the most brutally monoglot exclusionary society known for the last several hundred years. We are gradually changing, as it were. Did you happen to notice, for those of you who are old enough to vote or to accompany someone to vote, that the ballot was not merely in English last Tuesday? And in my university, there are quadrilingual signs for the personnel who clean and straighten up and do repairs and so on and so forth, precisely because people are gradually realizing that, in fact, while English is a lovely language, we celebrate its cultural riches and so forth, it's not the only language here by any means. And people are perhaps beginning to realize a tiny little bit that having multiple languages and being able to control multiple languages yourself is an asset, not a liability. Right? It's really quite extraordinary.
We have another question?
Yes, with all due respect, what did you mean when you said the accent from nowhere?
Oh, that's the general view that people have of what standard is. No, of course it's not from nowhere. We know where it's from. It's from the upper middle class in urban America, right? And it's from the people who set standard in institutional frameworks where these kinds of folks rely upon, like me, for example, rely upon our abilities with language for our very professions and livelihoods. Yes? So we know that, in fact, it's not from nowhere. It's from a very particular place, sociologically speaking. But the image of standard, which is what people say again and again when they go in for accent eradication, is, I don't want to sound identifiable. I want to sound like some kind, I guess maybe some kind of bionic speaker, you know.
I wanted to ask, you said English was monoglot, or our society was monoglot?
Again here, that's the kind of view that we have of what the ideal society should be. It goes back actually...
But isn't it true that American English has absorbed words from many different languages?
Oh, to be sure, but as it turns out, of course, there's no language in the world that hasn't absorbed many, many words from the languages that either surround it or of people who marry in and so on and so forth. From the smallest scale society to the largest scale society. All languages have lots and lots of loan words, as we call them, and loan expressions and so on and so forth. Even the The European languages, the modern European languages, have vast amounts of their highest register usage, which are basically what we call calques, translations from Latin, right? Because that was the prestige language of the time. So every language borrows. That's a kind of universal regularity, as it were. Frequently, of course, we can use those kinds of borrowings to trace cultural contacts of one sort or another, which is, of course, excellent in terms of the history of cultures.
We have time for one more question right here. Oh, it already answered. So if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Right over here.
I was interested in the standard English, and on the flip side of it, like if you go to a place like, in my experience, the South, where you speak the standard language, standard English, and people know right away you're not from around here, and that is like the reverse of being accepted, because that you're feel like an outsider because you're not talking like everyone else. I have a lot of Southern relatives, and I sometimes feel that way among them. It's like you visit them, and in North Carolina, wait, you're not from around here, so it's the opposite of being accepted. And I was just wondering if you could.
Well, the question is what the milieu is in which you're speaking relatively standardized English. As I said, if you go to the commercial precincts of downtown Atlanta, you're going to hear standard, basically, right among the people who work there. Right? So that is to say, it's crowded out in these particular precincts, professional precincts, upper middle class precincts, and so forth. It's crowded out the local dialect. So it has exactly the same kind of relative position as we saw on the diagram of New York, where the New York dialect, as such, is relegated to relative geographical peripheries in that sense. Right?
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to continue the conversation, Michael and Catherine will be in the gallery of the exhibit, and they would love to meet you there.